On April 4, 1965, a courier from the KGB residency in Kensington Palace Gardens carried a single-page cable to Moscow Centre, reporting that the British had cancelled TSR-2. The cable, later summarised in decrypted material passed to GCHQ during the Gordievsky debriefings, contained a note of caution from the resident. Verify before believing. The Soviets had spent nearly 6 years building intelligence files on the aircraft. Its titanium tolerances, its terrain-following radar, its Olympus 320 engines running white-hot on the Boscombe Down runway. The idea that Whitehall would simply destroy this machine, then order the surviving airframes broken up with oxyacetylene torches, seemed to Yuri Modin's successors in London to be either disinformation or madness. The aircraft in question was not strictly a Mach 3 interceptor. That was the parallel project, Avro's proposed Mach 3 development, and further back the ill-remembered Fairy Delta 3 studies of the late 1950s, alongside the P.1121 Hawker submissions. But the Soviet General Staff's Second Directorate had, by early 1965, blurred these programs together in their assessments. What mattered to Moscow was the composite British capability, high supersonic strike, low-level penetration, and the strategic reach implied by Blue Steel, and later, Skybolt. Britain, in Soviet eyes, was assembling a genuinely independent nuclear delivery architecture that did not depend on Washington's permission. Then, over 18 months, most of it vanished. The cancellations began with the Sandys White Paper of April 1957. The document that Duncan Sandys, Minister of Defence, delivered to Cabinet, arguing that manned aircraft would give way to missiles. Sandys wrote that the fighter and bomber were approaching obsolescence and that Britain's nuclear deterrent would rest on ballistic weapons. The air staff reeled. Sir Dermot Boyle, then Chief of the Air Staff, wrote privately to Sir Cyril Mills that the White Paper had done more damage to British aviation in 6 weeks than the Luftwaffe had achieved in 6 years. That paper killed the Fairy Delta 3 program in embryo, wounded the P.1121, and set the trajectory that would, 8 years later, reach TSR-2. Moscow's problem was procedural. The Soviet intelligence apparatus assumed that a state which had invested, by Treasury reckoning in the papers now held at TNA under T225, approximately £195 million in TSR, to development by early 1965, would not abandon that investment without a covert replacement. There had to be a hidden program. There had to be a black project the British were concealing behind the theatrics of cancellation. GRU stations across Western Europe were tasked, from May 1965, with locating it. They found nothing because nothing existed. The truth was more disorienting than deception. Britain had chosen, deliberately and in cabinet, to cede the high end of aviation to the Americans and later to European collaboration. Dennis Healey, arriving at the Ministry of Defence under Wilson in October 1964, had inherited a defence budget consuming 7% of GDP and a set of aircraft programs he considered financially unsustainable. His memoirs would later put it plainly. Britain could not afford to be a first-rank aerospace power and a first-rank welfare state simultaneously, and the second was worth more votes. What Healey did not say but Whitehall understood was that this decision would shape every subsequent negotiation with Washington for the next quarter century. The KGB's disbelief was, in its way, a compliment. It assumed a Britain more capable and more devious than the one Healey actually governed. The technical file the Soviets could not accept sat, and still sits, in the archives at Kew under AVIA 65 and DEFE 13. TSR-2, Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance, Mach 2, was designed by Sir Sidney Camp's successors at English Electric, working with Vickers Armstrongs, to a specification known as GOR.339. The requirement issued by the Air Staff in March 1957 called for an aircraft capable of low-level penetration of Soviet air defences at 200 feet above ground level, delivering a tactical nuclear weapon at ranges of up to 1,000 nautical miles from base and returning. It was to fly at Mach 2.05 at altitude and just under Mach 1 at deck height. Its terrain-following radar, developed by Ferranti at Edinburgh, would allow it to fly blind through cloud at speeds no Soviet interceptor of the period could match at that altitude band. The first prototype, XR-219, flew from Boscombe Down on September 27, 1964, with Roland Beaumont at the controls. Beaumont, who had flown Tempests over the Rhine in 1945 and later Lightnings, reported to the Ministry of Aviation that the aircraft handled better than any British type he had tested. His flight log entry, held now at the RAF Museum Hendon, noted exceptional stability, controls harmonized, no vices. By Flight 24 on February 22, 1965, XR-219 had exceeded Mach 1 in level flight, with reheat on only one engine. The Bristol Siddeley Olympus 320s were producing thrust ratings Rolls-Royce engineers described in internal memoranda as beyond specification. Soviet air intelligence, working through PGU sources within the French aerospace industry. Dassault engineers had received briefings on TSR-2's specifications during the abortive Anglo-French AFVG discussions, had built up a substantial dossier. Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, before his arrest and execution in May 1963, had passed material on British strategic thinking that included fragmentary references to the TSR-2 requirement. After Penkovsky's compromise, Moscow's collection tempo increased. By 1964, the KGB's London residency under Nikolai Karpykov was running at least 3 sources with peripheral access to the program, though none, the files subsequently released under Mitrokhin, reached the design core at Warton or Weybridge. What Moscow assessed was that TSR-2 represented a qualitative leap. The aircraft's specifications suggested it could evade the SA-2 guideline batteries deployed around Moscow, penetrate the PV Ostreni's radar coverage, and place a Redbeard or Yellow Sun weapon on any target west of the Urals. This was, in effect, an independent British capability to hold Soviet cities at risk without American assistance. The strategic prize the Attlee cabinet had authorized in January 1947 when it decided Britain would build its own bomb. Then Wilson's cabinet met on April 1, 1965. Healy presented the papers. TSR-2 was cancelled the same day. Sir Solly Zuckerman, chief scientific advisor, had briefed against it. The Treasury under James Callaghan had wanted the money. The RAF was told it could procure the American F-111K as a replacement, an order that would itself be cancelled 2 years later, leaving the air staff with neither the British aircraft nor the American one. Sir George Edwards, chairman of Vickers Armstrongs, was informed by telephone that afternoon. His response, recorded in the BAC internal history, was 3 words: "You bloody fools." The prototypes were ordered destroyed within weeks. Only XR-220 and XR-222 survived, saved by junior officers at RAF Cosford who quietly disobeyed the disposal instructions. The Soviets read the newspapers and did not believe a word. Inside the JIC, the assessment that filtered up to Downing Street through the spring of 1965 tried to reconstruct what Moscow was seeing. Sir Bernard Burroughs, chairing the Joint Intelligence Committee, circulated a paper, JIC 6523, which noted with characteristic understatement that Soviet analytical assumptions about British defence economics diverged sharply from the actual position. The Russians could not or would not price the trade-offs. They looked at capability and assumed capability implied intent, and intent implied resources. The paper was read in Wilson's private office at number 10 by Michael Halls, the Prime Minister's principal private secretary. Halls annotated it in green ink, his usual practice, with a note asking whether the JIC believed Soviet miscalculation was on balance useful to British interests. The question was strategic rather than rhetorical. If Moscow believed Britain retained a strike capability it had actually surrendered, that belief itself possessed deterrent value. This was, in essence, the doctrine that would sustain British defence policy for the next 20 years. The V-Force, Vulcans, Victors, Valiants until the Valiant's grounding in January 1965 for wing spar fatigue remained credible against Soviet air defenses only until roughly 1970. After that date, without a low-level penetrator, the RAF's nuclear delivery capability depended on Polaris from 4 Resolution-class submarines, the first of which, HMS Resolution, would not commission until October 1967. The gap in the Air Staff's classified assessment was real and it was dangerous. Dennis Healy understood this. His papers, released under the 30-year rule and now examined in Peter Hennessy's work on the secret state, show him wrestling with the arithmetic in the summer of 1965. Britain would maintain the appearance of tactical nuclear strike through the Buccaneer S.2 from the Royal Navy's carriers, and later, after further procurement rose, the F-4 Phantom in RAF service. Neither aircraft could do what TSR-2 had been designed to do. Both were compromises the Air Staff accepted with visible reluctance. Sir Charles Elworthy, Chief of the Defence Staff from 1967, put the position in a private memorandum to Healy dated November 14, 1967. Britain's conventional strike capability east of the Iron Curtain had, he wrote, diminished to the point where deterrence rests on nuclear release authority alone, and the credibility of that authority depends on assumptions about American consent that we cannot verify in peacetime. The document DEFE 25/240 at Q is one of the frankest admissions of dependency in the entire Cold War archive. Moscow, meanwhile, continued to search for the phantom British program. The KGB's Line X, responsible for scientific and technical intelligence, tasked officers under diplomatic cover to cultivate contacts at Farnborough, at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, at BAC's Preston Division. Oleg Kalugin, later KGB Chief of Foreign Counterintelligence, referred in his post-1991 memoirs to a persistent working hypothesis in Moscow through the late 1960s that the British had transferred TSR-2's capabilities into a covert program, possibly involving reconnaissance variants operating from Cyprus or Malta. There was no such program. The archives at Kew, systematically opened from 1996 onwards, contain no trace of one, because none was ever authorized. What existed was a gap, and around that gap the Ministry of Defence built a careful architecture of ambiguity. The Chevaline program, initiated under Heath in 1972 and continued under Wilson and Callaghan, was the eventual British answer, an upgrade to Polaris warheads to defeat the Galosh anti-ballistic missile system around Moscow. Its existence was concealed from Parliament for 8 years. Its cost, when finally disclosed by Francis Pym in January 1980, was £1 billion. The Soviets, when they learned of Chevaline, understood it as confirmation. Britain had been hiding something all along. They had simply been hiding the wrong thing. Oleg Gordievsky's defection in July 1985, spirited out of Moscow through Finland by MI6 in an operation that Christopher Andrews' Authorized History of the Security Service describes only in outline, brought with it a substantial understanding of what Soviet intelligence had and had not believed about British aviation and strategic capability across 3 decades. Gordievsky had risen through the London residency between 1982 and 1985, and before that had access to the first Chief Directorate's British desk archives. His debriefings at a safe house in the West Country, conducted through the autumn of 1985 by officers of MI6's Sovblock Controllerate, returned repeatedly to the question of what Moscow had assessed about British defence decisions. Gordievsky's summary, later reflected in his co-authored work with Andrew, was blunt. The KGB had, throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, systematically overestimated British capabilities and systematically underestimated British willingness to reduce them. The cancellation of TSR-2 had been treated in Moscow as maskirovka, deception, for at least 5 years after the event. The reasons were institutional. Soviet military intelligence assessments were produced by officers whose careers depended on identifying threats rather than downplaying them. a GRU colonel who reported that the British had genuinely abandoned high-end aviation capability, would find his report questioned, his sources doubted, his next posting reconsidered. The bias ran one way. It ran towards worst-case assumption. There was also a genuine analytical problem. The Wilson government's Defence Review of 1965 to 66, culminating in the Statement on Defence Estimates of February 1966, announced withdrawals from east of Suez, the cancellation of the CVA-01 aircraft carrier program, and confirmation of TSR-2's replacement by the F111K, which would itself be cancelled in January 1968 during the Sterling crisis. Each decision viewed in isolation from Moscow could be read as tactical. Viewed together, they described a fundamental strategic contraction. But strategic contractions in Marxist-Leninist analytical frameworks were what capitalist powers claimed to be doing while doing the opposite. The framework itself resisted the evidence. Sir Maurice Oldfield, chief of MI6 from 1973 to 1978, understood this dynamic well. In a paper prepared for Callahan's incoming administration in the spring of 1976, Oldfield noted that British capabilities were, in a meaningful sense, whatever the Soviets believed them to be. If Moscow thought Britain retained a first strike option, that belief structured Soviet planning regardless of the underlying reality. The trick was to encourage the belief without spending the money that would make it true. This calculated ambiguity ran through British defence policy into the Thatcher years. When Margaret Thatcher committed in July 1980 to the Trident C4 and then to the D5 in March 1982, she did so partly on the strategic logic that Chevaline was insufficient against Soviet ABM upgrades expected in the late 1980s. The public debate, much of it conducted around the CND marches of 1981 and 1982, the encampment at Greenham Common from September 1981, treated the decision as one about deterrence. The private calculation, visible in the Cabinet Office papers now in the CAB 148 series, treated it as one about credibility. What did Moscow believe Britain would do? Gordievsky's material suggested that Moscow by the early 1980s had adjusted its assessments. The residency reports of 1983 and 1984, which Gordievsky himself helped draft or vet, described Britain as a reliable adjunct to American strategic policy rather than an independent nuclear power. The formulation was, from the Soviet perspective, a downgrade. From Whitehall's perspective, when the JIC read the extracted material in 1986, it was almost a relief. The pretense had cost less than the reality would have. TSR-2's ghost had finally been laid, 21 years after XR-219 stopped flying. The human cost of the 1965 decision registered slowly, and in places the strategic debate never reached. Preston in Lancashire had built military aircraft since 1937. The English Electric Works at Warton and Samlesbury employed, at their TSR-2 peak in 1964, some 18,000 people between them. The Bristol Siddeley Engine Works at Filton employed another 9,000 on the Olympus 320 programme. The Ferranti Electronics Division at Edinburgh Silvernose contributed a further 2,400. When Healy announced the cancellation on April 6, 1965 in the Commons, he acknowledged in his statement that some 15,000 jobs would be affected across the supply chain, though the actual figure across all tiers of subcontracting reached higher. Preston's Labour MP, Julian Amery, a Conservative in fact who had been Minister of Aviation until the previous October, spoke in the Commons debate that afternoon with a bitterness that survives in Hansard's flat typography. He accused Wilson's government of gambling with the industrial future of the north of England on the throw of a treasury dice. Amery had signed off on TSR-2's development contract in 1963. He knew what the cancellation meant on the ground in Lancashire. The BBC's regional news from Manchester the following week, footage held now in the Northwest Film Archive at Manchester Metropolitan University, showed workers leaving the Samlesbury gate at shift change, being interviewed by a young reporter with a felt-tipped microphone. One machinist, named in the transcript only as Frank, said he had built parts for the Canberra, then for the Lightning, then for TSR-2, and did not know what came next. His anger was quiet. The reporter, uncertain what to ask, moved on. What came next was the slow amalgamation of the British aircraft industry into what became in 1977 British Aerospace. English Electric merged with Bristol into BAC in 1960 already. Hawker Siddeley had absorbed Avro, Gloucester and de Havilland. The government's rationale, articulated by Anthony Wedgwood Benn as Minister of Technology from July 1966, was that only consolidated firms could compete internationally. The workers understood something different. Consolidation meant redundancy programs managed at longer distance, by boards less accountable to the shop floors of Preston or Coventry or Kingston upon Thames. Barrow in Furness offered a parallel case that shaped Whitehall thinking in the opposite direction. The Vickers shipyard there, building Resolution-class submarines under the Polaris program through the late 1960s, retained its workforce because Polaris was strategic and could not be relocated. HMS Resolution laid down in February 1964. HMS Repulse in March 1965. HMS Renown in June 1964. HMS Revenge in May 1965. 4 boats, 4 Polaris tubes each, 16 missiles carrying the entirety of the British deterrent from 1969 onwards. Barrow's employment held. Preston's did not. The geographical politics of this mattered. Wilson's cabinet contained ministers, Callaghan at the Treasury, Crossman at Housing, who represented urban constituencies where defence employment was less central than trade union arithmetic in the docks and the pits. Preston's TSR-2 workers had fewer defenders around the cabinet table than the Clyde's shipbuilders or the Yorkshire miners. The decision to cancel was, among other things, a political calculation about which industrial communities Labour needed to protect and which it could afford to disappoint. The Emery family archive at Churchill College, Cambridge, contains correspondence from 1965 to 1966, in which former Ministry of Aviation officials wrote to Julian Amery about the mood in Lancashire. One letter from a superintendent at Warton described walking through the Assembly Hall in May 1965 and finding half the fixtures empty, the airframes gone. "We built something the world had not seen," he wrote, "and now we build the tools to break it up." By the autumn of 1968, the strategic architecture the Wilson government had assembled to replace TSR-2 was itself collapsing. The F-111K purchase, announced in February 1966 as the replacement, had been cancelled in January 1968 after the November 1967 devaluation of sterling forced a further round of defence economies. The RAF was now formally without a dedicated long-range strike aircraft. The Buccaneer S.2, transferred from the Royal Navy after the CVA-01 carrier cancellation, would take on part of the role. The Vulcan B.2, already 12 years in service, would soldier on with WE.177 tactical nuclear weapons and freefall bombs into the late 1970s and, in reconnaissance form, into the Falklands. The Air Staff Assessment of December 1968, written for CAS Sir John Grandy, DEFE 24/166, described the resulting capability as materially inferior to the position assumed in 1957 and progressively worse than the position assumed in 1962. The paper reached Healy's desk on December 19th. His annotation in blue ballpoint read, "Note taken, options limited." The options were indeed limited. Anglo-French collaboration on the variable geometry AFVG project had collapsed in 1967 when Dassault withdrew. French intelligence, working through channels the DGSE would only partially acknowledge, had assessed the British commitment as unreliable after TSR-2 and preferred to develop what became the Mirage G on their own terms. The MRCA discussions with West Germany and Italy, which would eventually produce the Tornado, were in their preliminary stages. The Panavia Consortium would not be formally established until March 1969. The Tornado GR1 would not enter RAF service until 1980, 15 years after TSR-2 had been cancelled. For those 15 years, British long-range strike capability was, in the phrase used in one JIC assessment of 1974, a matter of ingenious improvisation. The Buccaneers of 12 Squadron and 208 Squadron at Honington from October 1969, later joined by 15 and 16 squadrons at RAF Larbruch in West Germany, provided the visible teeth. Their crews trained relentlessly on low-level penetration profiles across the North German plain, and, more secretly, on the western approaches to Soviet air defense corridors, identified by GCHQ signals intelligence. The Buccaneer was a good aircraft. It was not the aircraft the RAF had wanted. Its range at low level with weapons was approximately 500 nautical miles, less than TSR-2's specification. Its avionics, though upgraded through the 1970s under the Blue Parrot radar improvements and later PAVE Spike laser designation, never approached the terrain-following capability Ferranti had built for TSR-2. Its top speed at altitude was Mach 0.85, not Mach 2.05. Soviet air defenses upgraded steadily through the same period. The SA-6 Gainful, deployed from 1970, closed the low-altitude gap that had made the original TSR-2 requirement viable. By the late 1970s, GCHQ assessments circulating through the JIC CAB 186 series indicated that a Buccaneer penetration of Warsaw packed airspace at the depths TSR-2 had been designed to reach would incur losses at rates the RAF could not sustain past the first 48 hours of a conventional war. This was, in a strict military sense, the price of April 1965. British conventional deterrence in the Central European theatre depended, from roughly 1972 onwards, on nuclear escalation being credible. The chieftain divisions of BAOR at Hereford and Bergen were a tripwire. The V-Force and later Polaris were the response. The interval between tripwire and response, which TSR-2 had been intended partly to fill, remained empty. Whether this mattered depends on assumptions about how a war would have unfolded that thankfully remained untested. What is clear from the archives is that senior officers, from Grandy through Sir Neil Cameron in the mid-1970s, believed it mattered a great deal and said so in memoranda that ministers filed and did not act upon. Then came 1979 and Thatcher, and a different arithmetic. Margaret Thatcher's approach to the strategic problem TSR-2 had bequeathed was structurally different from her predecessors. She began from the assumption articulated in her first major defence speech at Kensington Town Hall in January 1976, while still leader of the opposition, that British defence had been cut to the point of danger and would need substantial rebuilding. The speech drew the Soviet embassy's attention. TASS labelled her the Iron Lady on January 24, 1976, a designation she embraced. By the time she entered Downing Street in May 1979, the strategic environment had changed. NATO's dual-track decision of December 1979 authorised the deployment of Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles in Western Europe, with cruise sites at RAF Greenham Common and RAF Molesworth. The Soviet SS-20 deployment, begun in 1976, had already deployed 168 launchers by 1979. The theatre nuclear balance in Europe had tilted, and the political response, massive CND marches through London in October 1980 and October 1981, drawing crowds estimated by the Metropolitan Police at 250,000, created a domestic environment in which every defence decision became publicly contested. Thatcher's response was to increase real defence spending by 3% annually through her first term, exceeding NATO's target. But she also faced the same underlying question Wilson had faced 15 years earlier. What could Britain actually afford, and where should the money go? The 1981 Defence Review under John Nott published as Command 8288 in June 1981, proposed cutting the surface Royal Navy substantially. 2 carriers would be reduced to 1. The amphibious ships HMS Fearless and HMS Intrepid were to be paid off. The ice patrol vessel HMS Endurance was to be withdrawn from the South Atlantic. The Argentine junta, reading the signals from Whitehall, drew conclusions that would produce the Falklands War of April to June 1982. That is a different story, though its consequences fed back into the TSR-2 question in one specific way. The Vulcan B-2 raids on Port Stanley Airfield in May 1982, the Black Buck missions flown from Ascension Island with Victor tanker support, required aerial refueling operations of a complexity that pushed the Vulcan force to its absolute operational limit. XM-607, flown by Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers of 44 Squadron on May 1, 1982, dropped 21 1,000-pound bombs across the runway. The raid succeeded marginally. Air Marshal Sir John Curtis, who commanded the air element of Operation Corporate, reflected in his subsequent Staff College lecture, the text of which survives in the RAF historical branch, that if the Vulcans had been withdrawn a year earlier as planned, the Black Buck raids would not have been possible. Britain would have possessed no aircraft capable of striking Port Stanley from Ascension. The last-minute stay of execution for the Vulcan force granted in the 1981 review had been decisive. The lesson Thatcher and her advisers drew was not the one the air staff would have preferred. The Vulcans had performed heroically at the end of their service lives. The conclusion was that improvisation had worked once in a specific set of circumstances against a third-rate air force. It would not work against Soviet air defenses, and no policy should be built on the assumption that it would. Tornado GR-1 entered squadron service with 9 Squadron at RAF Honington in June 1982, while the Falklands War was still being fought. Its arrival closed at last the capability gap that had opened on April 6, 1965. It had taken 17 years and required collaboration with West Germany and Italy that would have been politically impossible in 1965. Britain no longer built strike aircraft alone. It built them with partners, and it paid a share, and it accepted the constraints. The Soviet assessments of the Tornado, when Gordievsky reviewed them in his debriefings, described it accurately. There was no phantom capability lurking behind it. The pretense had ended. The last chapter of the story runs through the release of documents, not the flight of aircraft. When the 30-year rule opened the 1965 Cabinet Papers in January 1996, the TSR-2 files came out under John Major's government, and historians began the reconstruction that had been impossible while the participants remained active. Peter Hennessy, working through the Cabinet Office papers for what became the Secret State, published in 2002, established the fiscal arithmetic that had driven the decision. Lawrence Freedman, in his official history of the Falklands, and subsequently in his broader work on British nuclear policy, traced the consequences forward. Sir Michael Howard, in a lecture at King's College London in November 1993, had already made the essential argument. British defence policy from 1957 onwards, he said, had been a sustained exercise in elegant retreat, the management of relative decline in a way that preserved influence disproportionate to resources. TSR-2's cancellation was not a mistake within that framework, it was consistent with the framework. What had been unusual was the illusion, maintained for so long in Moscow, that Britain still operated within the framework of 1945. That illusion had cost the Soviets substantial resources. The Second Directorate of the GRU maintained into the 1980s an entire section devoted to British aerospace capability. Its estimates, when Gordievsky and later Vasily Mitrokhin brought them to Western attention, showed the pattern of assumptions Sir Bernard Burroughs had identified in 1965. Moscow had spent 30 years chasing British programs that did not exist. The economic dimension was calculable in a rough way. Britain's defence spending as a share of GDP fell from 7.1% in 1965 to 4.2% in 1991. The Soviet Union's, though the figures were disputed even inside Gosplan, was estimated by Western analysts at 15 to 20% through the 1970s and 1980s. Some fraction of that spending, impossible to quantify precisely, was driven by assessments of British capability that were inflated by institutional bias and by the plausible reading that a country which cancelled TSR-2 must be concealing something equivalent. Thatcher meeting Gorbachev at Chequers on December 16, 1984 in the encounter she would characterize as the moment she decided the Soviet leadership was a man we can do business with, was engaging a Soviet system that had, in one narrow but significant respect, been overestimating what it was up against. Britain had been playing a weaker hand than Moscow believed. The bluff sustained through 6 governments across nearly 3 decades had contributed marginally but genuinely to the pressures that would produce Gorbachev's reforms and the eventual collapse of the Soviet system in 1991. XR-220, the surviving prototype at RAF Cosford, sits now in the Cold War exhibition at the Royal Air Force Museum. Its Ferranti radar has been removed. Its Olympus engines are cold. Visitors pass it and read the panel and mostly do not understand what they are looking at. The aircraft never entered squadron service. It never dropped a weapon. Its cancellation is remembered chiefly in the aviation press as an industrial tragedy. The archives at Kew tell a more complicated story. TSR-2 was cancelled because Britain could not afford it. Its cancellation was believed to be deception because the Soviet system was structurally unable to accept that a state would surrender capability voluntarily. That belief, for as long as it persisted, contributed to Britain's Cold War posture in ways no British minister had planned and few subsequently understood. The Iron Lady's phrase in 1976 had been closer to the mark than Moscow realized. Britain had been cut to the point of danger. Moscow had simply refused to see it. By the time the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin on Christmas Day 1991, the aircraft that had been cancelled 26 years earlier had achieved in absentia more than most aircraft that actually flew.